Welcome to Top 10 Secret, where the darkest secrets are unveiled. Tonight, join us as we step into the misty shadows under the moonlight, where the most terrifying, spine-chilling, and haunting stories await. This is the Top 10 Horrifying Moonlit Tales. Mysteries that will send shivers down your spine and make you think twice before looking out the window when night falls. Are you ready? Be careful, for fear might be lurking right behind you. Story 1. Blood Moon Night. Deep within the darkest forest of the world, a place known as Soul Woods, legends of haunting spirits have instilled fear in people for centuries. It is a forbidden area where anyone who dares to step foot during the nights of the blood moon is said to never return. The legend says that when the blood moon illuminates the forest, the Reaper appears. He is no ordinary being, but a towering skeleton clad in a black cloak, his hollow eyes glowing with an eerie green light like flames. His bony finger points outward, sometimes as if delivering a death sentence. Other times as if pondering Edrin was a poor hunter living in a small village on the edge of Soul Woods. Many had warned him not to enter the forest, but starvation and greed placed him in a situation where he had no other choice. He had heard rumors that deep within the woods roamed rare white deer, believed to bring luck and wealth. On the first night of the blood moon, Edran decided to take the risk. As he tracked the white deer's footprints, he felt the forest grow darker and more oppressive. Distant screams echoed through the woods, like the cries of tormented souls. Suddenly, he came face to face with the Reaper. The colossal figure pointed a skeletal finger at him, and Edrin felt the overwhelming weight of a curse and a veiled threat. The Reaper looked directly at him and spoke in a cold, resonant voice, echoing like thunder. "You dare enter here? You will bear the burdens of the sins humanity has inflicted upon this forest. Every tormented soul shall find a guide in you. There is no escape." From that moment, Edrin began his journey to deliver the souls to peace. In his hands, he carried a lantern emitting a green light, the embodiment of the first soul he was tasked to protect. Day by day, Edrin's fear grew. Each soul demanded that he confront their tragic past, and sometimes, those very souls turned on him when they refused to accept their fate. As days turned to weeks, Edrin realized that every soul was tied to a curse linked to the forest. These curses not only haunted the souls, but also weighed heavily on him. With every soul he helped find rest, he felt a part of himself slipping away, as if the forest was slowly consuming him. At the end of his journey, when Edrin brought the final soul to its destined place, he discovered it was not just any soul, it was his own. In a cursed mirror, he saw his reflection withering away, his eyes turning hollow, just like the Reaper's. Behind him, a chilling laugh echoed. "You have completed your mission, but did you think you would be free? No, you are now a part of this forest. From this moment on, you are the Reaper." Edrin felt the curse fully consume him. Helpless, he could only watch as his own form dissolved into the darkness, becoming one of the wandering spirits of the forest. Villagers near the forest occasionally hear blood-curdling screams on nights when the blood moon rises. Over time, they came to realize that Edrin's tale was not just a legend, but a perpetual curse of the Soul Woods. No one dares to enter, for they know that one day they too might become the next victim of the new Reaper. Story 2. Smoke and the Curse. In the heart of a sleepless city, amidst neon lights flickering with artificial vitality, lies a bar that no one dares name aloud. Hidden down a narrow alleyway, its entrance is marked by a door made of ancient, scarred wood and a skull symbol burned into its surface. Locals call it Gray Smoke, a place whispered about in hushed tones. For those who enter often never leave the same. Behind the counter stands a legend cloaked in dread, the skeletal figure known as The Bone Smoker. Decades ago, he was a biker, a ruthless leader of an outlaw gang notorious for leaving trails of blood and destruction. Known as Jareth, his greed for power and dominance made him unstoppable. But one fateful night, during a high-speed chase with law enforcement, his motorcycle flew off a cliff into a bottomless abyss. While his body was never found, whispers spoke of a pact, an unholy deal struck with a demon at the edge of death. Jareth didn't die. Instead, he was reborn as something far worse, an emissary of darkness, a harbinger of despair, tasked with claiming the souls of the desperate and damned. His appearance became legend, a skeleton cloaked in leather, smoke perpetually wafting from his smoldering cigar, and hollow eyes glowing like embers from hell. The bar is no ordinary place. Those who enter are often lured by despair, their souls fractured and vulnerable. The Bone Smoker waits behind the counter, his skeletal hands moving with eerie precision, pouring drinks darker than ink. The air is heavy with smoke, not just from his ever-burning cigar, but from the collective despair of those trapped within. On the wall hangs a clock with no hands, its ticking irregular, as if it marks moments stolen from time itself. The bar's patrons are shadows of their former selves, their eyes hollow and their voices whispers, trapped in an eternal limbo between life and death. One stormy night, a young man named Caleb stumbled into the bar. A gambler and drifter, Caleb had lost everything: his fortune, his friends, and his hope. Rain-soaked and desperate, he stepped into gray smoke, unaware of the doom that awaited him. The Bone Smoker greeted him with a crooked grin. "Welcome," he rasped, his voice like the grinding of bones. "You look like a man in need of something stronger than drink." Caleb hesitated but nodded, his eyes darting around the dimly lit room. The patrons seemed to watch him, their faces obscured by shadows. He felt a chill crawl down his spine. "What is this place?" Caleb asked. The Bone Smoker chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "A refuge for the lost, but nothing here comes without a price." Caleb's desperation overcame his fear. "I've lost everything," he confessed. "I just need a way to start over." The Bone Smoker leaned forward, smoke curling around his skeletal features. "I can give you what you desire: wealth, power, revenge. But every wish comes at a cost. Are you willing to pay?" Caleb hesitated. "What's the cost?" The Bone Smoker's grin widened. "Your soul will be mine when your time runs out. Until then, you'll have everything you've ever wanted." Desperation clouded Caleb's judgment. "Fine," he said. "I accept." The Bone Smoker handed him a cigar, its surface etched with glowing runes. "Smoke this," he instructed, "and your wish will come true." Caleb lit the cigar and inhaled deeply. Immediately, his mind swirled with visions. Gold spilling from chests, enemies groveling at his feet, and women drawn to his newfound charisma. But as the visions faded, a searing pain coursed through his body. He fell to the floor, writhing in agony. The Bone Smoker watched impassively. "Power always comes with pain," he said. "You'll get used to it." When Caleb stood, his eyes burned with a supernatural glow. He felt invincible, the weight of his failures lifted. But deep inside, something dark had taken root. Over the following months, Caleb's life transformed. He became a wealthy tycoon, crushing his enemies and reclaiming everything he had lost. Yet, as his power grew, so did the whispers in his mind. At night, he was haunted by shadows, their faces those of the people he had wronged. The cigar never left his side, its smoke a constant reminder of the deal he had made. One night, as he stared into a mirror, he noticed something horrifying. His reflection was fading. His flesh grew pale, his veins darkened, and his features began to resemble those of the Bone Smoker. Panic consumed him. He returned to gray smoke, demanding answers. You're becoming what you chose to be, the bone smoker said calmly. A collector of souls. No, Caleb shouted. This isn't what I wanted. The bone smoker leaned in, his hollow eyes boring into Caleb's. Every deal has its end. Now your time has come. Caleb tried to flee, but the bar transformed around him. The walls closed in, the shadows came alive, and skeletal hands reached for him from every direction. The bone smoker stood in the center, his laughter echoing like thunder. You can't escape, he said. You're mine now. Caleb's screams were swallowed by the smoke, his body dissolving into ash. When the air cleared, a new shadowy figure stood behind the bar, its glowing eyes a mirror of the bone smoker's. But Caleb's torment didn't end. Trapped in his new form, he found himself cursed to serve in the bar, watching as desperate souls stumbled in, repeating the same mistakes he had made. The bone smoker, now a shadowy overseer, watched Caleb with a cruel grin, a constant reminder of his eternal servitude. Every soul adds to the fire, the bone smoker whispered one night, as Caleb lit yet another cigar for a new victim. And the fire never goes out. Caleb realized, in that moment, that his curse wasn't just eternal service. It was to witness over and over the endless cycle of human desperation and greed, a torment more excruciating than any physical pain. Now, on nights when the wind carries the faint scent of burning tobacco, those who pass by gray smoke hear muffled screams and whispers of despair. And the bone smoker, alongside his cursed protege, waits patiently for the next soul to wander into their grasp. The door remains open, the smoke lingers, and the cycle continues. To this day, gray smoke still stands as a silent beacon for the desperate and damned. Those who enter seeking solace often leave as something else entirely, if they leave at all. And the bone smoker's reign endures, one soul at a time, sealed forever in smoke and ash. Story 3. The Shadow in the Dark. In the quiet, unassuming suburbs of a sprawling city, a young woman named Anna moved into her new apartment. Her life was simple, perhaps too simple. She spent her days at work, her evenings reading, and her nights alone in her one-bedroom flat. Life had not been kind to Anna. She had recently ended a long-term relationship and struggled to find meaning in her solitary existence. Little did she know, her loneliness would invite something far darker into her life. It began subtly. Anna would wake up in the middle of the night with a strange feeling of being watched. She dismissed it as her imagination, a product of living alone for the first time. But the feeling persisted. Each morning, she would find her bed covers slightly displaced, as if someone had been sitting at the edge of her bed. One night, she awoke to a soft whisper. The room was cold, unnaturally so, and she could feel her breath forming faint clouds in the air. Her heart pounded as her eyes scanned the darkness. Then she saw it. A figure standing in the corner of her room. It was tall, cloaked in shadows, with eyes that glowed red like embers. Anna froze, unable to scream, unable to move. The figure tilted its head as if studying her, before vanishing into the darkness. The next day, Anna convinced herself it had been a nightmare. But deep down, she knew it was something more. Over the following nights, the visits became more frequent. The shadowy figure no longer lingered in the corner. It would stand closer to her bed, its red eyes unblinking. Sometimes, she would feel its cold presence behind her, its breath chilling her neck. Anna's health began to deteriorate. She grew pale, with dark circles under her eyes from countless sleepless nights. Her co-workers noticed her decline and asked if she was okay, but Anna could only nod, too afraid to tell anyone the truth. She feared they would think she was crazy. One night, She tried to confront the figure. When it appeared at the foot of her bed, she mustered all her courage and whispered, "What do you want?" The shadow leaned closer, its voice a low growl that reverberated through the room. "You." Anna woke up the next morning with a burning sensation on her wrist. Looking down, she saw a strange mark, a sigil etched into her skin as if burned by an invisible hand. Panic set in, and she spent the day researching symbols and curses. Her search led her to tales of shadow entities, malevolent beings that fed on fear and despair. That night, she placed salt around her bed and burned sage, hoping to ward off the entity. But it was futile. The shadow returned, its red eyes blazing with fury. It swept the salt aside as if it were nothing and extinguished the sage with a mere wave of its hand. "You cannot escape me," it hissed. "You invited me in with your loneliness. I will not leave until I take what is mine." Desperate, Anna sought help from a local spiritual healer named Margot. The old woman listened intently as Anna recounted her experiences, her weathered face growing grim. "You've been marked," Margot said. "This shadow is not just a random entity. It's a collector, a hunter of souls. It preys on those who are vulnerable, drawing strength from their fear until it consumes them completely." Margot prepared a cleansing ritual for Anna, instructing her to stay awake and vigilant throughout the night. "No matter what happens, do not speak to it," Margot warned. "Do not engage with it." That night, Anna lit the candles and placed protective talismans around her room. As midnight approached, the air grew heavy, and the shadows in her apartment seemed to deepen. At exactly 3 a.m., the entity appeared, its form more solid than ever before. It stepped closer to Anna, its red eyes burning with malice. "You cannot banish me," it growled. "I am a part of you now." Anna clenched her fists, determined not to respond. The shadow circled her, whispering her deepest fears and regrets. It spoke of her failed relationship, her loneliness, and the emptiness she felt every day. Tears streamed down Anna's face, but she stayed silent. The entity grew angrier, its whispers turning into roars. The room shook, the candles flickered, and the talismans shattered one by one. Anna's resolve wavered, and in a moment of weakness, she screamed, "Leave me alone!" The shadow froze, its red eyes narrowing. "As you wish," it said, a cruel smile forming on its featureless face. Anna woke up the next morning to an eerie silence. For the first time in weeks, the apartment felt normal. She convinced herself that the entity was gone, that she had finally rid herself of its presence. But that night, as she lay in bed, she felt an icy grip around her wrists and ankles. Her eyes flew open, and she saw the shadow looming over her, its red eyes glowing brighter than ever. "You invited me back," it said. "Now you are mine." Anna tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow enveloped her, its darkness seeping into her skin. She felt her body grow cold, her mind slipping into a void. The last thing she saw was the entity's glowing eyes as it whispered, "Sleep now, for eternity awaits." Anna's disappearance baffled her friends and neighbors. Her apartment was found in perfect order, with no signs of struggle. The only clue was a single burnt-out candle on her bedside table and a faint, lingering smell of sulfur. The apartment remained vacant, but tenants who moved in afterward reported strange occurrences. They spoke of whispers in the night, cold spots, and the feeling of being watched. Some claimed to see glowing red eyes in the darkness. The legend of Anna and the shadow entity grew, spreading fear among the locals. To this day, no one stays in the apartment for long. And on quiet, moonless nights, some say you can still hear Anna's voice, faint and desperate, begging for release from the darkness. If you ever feel a cold presence behind you, If you hear whispers in the dead of night, or if you see red eyes glowing in the dark, do not turn around. Do not speak. For the shadow is always watching, always waiting. And once it marks you, there is no escape. Story 4. The Bone Doll. In the heart of a forgotten forest, there was a village no one dared to visit. It was said that anyone who ventured there disappeared without a trace. The story spoke of a child with a face pale as death, clutching a grotesque doll with a skull for a head and empty, glowing eyes. The villagers once called her Aveline, but after the events that unfolded, they had another name for her: the Cursed Girl. Years ago, Aveline was just a little girl living with her mother, Elise, on the outskirts of the village. Elise was a seamstress who worked tirelessly to support them after Aveline's father had mysteriously disappeared in the forest. The house was modest but warm, and Aveline's days were filled with dreams of playing with other children, something her mother forbade out of fear of the forest's legends. One fateful day, while Elise was away working, Aveline ventured into the attic to explore. Hidden under layers of dust and cobwebs, she found a doll unlike any she had ever seen. It had a face made of cracked porcelain, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare into her soul. The body was stitched together from patches of old fabric, and its hands and feet were made of something that felt like brittle bone. Despite its eerie appearance, Aveline felt drawn to it. She named the doll Lila. From the moment Lila entered Aveline's life, everything changed. At first, it was small things. Aveline would hear whispers when she held Lila, faint voices speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Her dreams became vivid and strange, filled with dark forests and glowing red eyes watching her from the shadows. But she told no one. Lila became her closest companion, the only one who listened to her secrets and fears. Soon, the other children in the village began to notice Aveline's strange behavior. She would sit alone by the edge of the forest, whispering to the doll, her pale blue eyes glazed over as if in a trance. When approached, she would snap out of it and glare at them, her demeanor cold and distant. Then the disappearances began. The first to vanish was a boy named Theo, known for his mischievous nature. He had teased Aveline about her doll one too many times. One evening, he followed her into the forest, determined to scare her. He was never seen again. His parents searched tirelessly, but all they found was a small pile of bones arranged in the shape of a crude doll. After Theo, others followed. Each time, the villagers found the same grim remnants: bones shaped into tiny dolls left at the edge of the forest. The villagers grew paranoid, locking their doors and keeping their children close. They whispered about Aveline and her cursed doll, blaming them for the horrors. Elise, too, began to notice her daughter's strange behavior. Aveline would stare into the doll's hollow eyes for hours, murmuring words Elise couldn't understand. At night, Elise would hear laughter echoing from Aveline's room, not her daughter's, but a voice cold and sinister. One night, Elise tried to take the doll away. Aveline screamed, her voice unlike anything human, and the lights in the house flickered violently. Elise dropped the doll in terror as Aveline snatched it back, clutching it protectively. "She's mine," Aveline hissed, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. By the time the village realized the danger, it was too late. The night of the blood moon arrived, and with it, Aveline disappeared into the forest, clutching Lila tightly. The villagers, desperate to end the curse, gathered torches and weapons to search for her. They followed the sound of her haunting laughter, echoing through the trees. Deep in the forest, they found her standing in a clearing surrounded by twisted, dead trees. In her arms, Lila no longer looked like a simple doll. Its porcelain face had transformed into a grinning skull, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural red light. Aveline's pale skin seemed almost translucent under the moonlight, and her voice was a mixture of childlike innocence and something far older, far darker. "Why are you here?" she asked, tilting her head. "Don't you know? Lila doesn't like visitors." Before anyone could respond, the shadows around them came alive. Figures formed from darkness, their skeletal faces mirroring the doll's twisted grin. The villagers tried to flee, but the shadows closed in, dragging them into the earth one by one. By dawn, the forest was silent again. The villagers who had stayed behind found the clearing empty except for Aveline's house, now a ruin covered in vines. On the front steps lay Lila, her eyes glowing faintly as if mocking them. None dared to touch it. Over the years, the forest grew darker, and the village was abandoned. Travelers who ventured near the area spoke of a pale girl with hollow eyes, cradling a doll made of bone. They said she would approach silently, her voice soft and sweet as she asked, "Will you play with us?" Those who answered yes were never seen again. Decades later, a group of paranormal investigators decided to explore the legend of Aveline and her bone doll. They entered the forest armed with cameras, equipment, and confidence. As night fell, they reached the clearing where Aveline was said to appear. They set up their equipment, laughing nervously as they waited. At exactly midnight, the laughter began. It started faint and distant, but quickly grew louder, echoing from all directions. The investigators froze as a figure stepped into the clearing. Aveline's appearance hadn't changed in all those years. Her pale skin glowed under the moonlight, and in her arms, Lila's skeletal face seemed to sneer at them. "Will you play with us?" Aveline asked, her voice soft and melodic. The investigators didn't answer. They stood paralyzed with fear as shadows began to rise from the ground, surrounding them. One by one, they were dragged into the darkness, their screams silenced by the forest. To this day, the forest remains untouched, a place of whispered legends and unspoken fears. On nights of the blood moon, some say you can still hear Aveline's laughter and see the faint glow of Lila's eyes watching from the shadows. Travelers who venture too close often vanish, their belongings found arranged in strange, doll-like shapes. And so, the legend of the bone doll lives on, a haunting reminder of the darkness that lingers in forgotten places and the innocence twisted by evil. If you ever find yourself near that forest and hear a child's voice asking to play, remember this: do not answer, for once you accept, you belong to her forever. Story 5. The Curse of the Bone Scarecrow. In the desolate outskirts of a forgotten village, surrounded by barren fields stretching endlessly under the oppressive sky, there existed a place the locals dared not mention aloud. They called it the Field of Bones. Once a thriving expanse of golden wheat, the land had long since been abandoned, its rich soil turned to ash, and its borders marked by broken wooden stakes that served as a warning to all who passed by. Yet the most horrifying marker of all was the scarecrow that stood in the field. A grotesque figure crafted not from straw and old clothes, but from the skeletal remains of the damned. Centuries ago, the Field of Bones had been the lifeblood of the village. The wheat it yielded fed the people and brought wealth to the land. But such prosperity attracted greed. A powerful landowner named Aldrich seized the fields from the villagers, forcing them into backbreaking labor under the promise of survival. Starvation loomed, and desperation pushed the villagers to their breaking point. They sought the aid of an outcast witch who lived on the edges of the forest. The witch, known only as Iskra, agreed to help but warned them of the cost. "The curse I weave will avenge your suffering, but it will not end with Aldrich. The land itself will be damned, and the bones of the betrayed will rise to claim their vengeance." Blinded by rage, the villagers accepted. On the night of the harvest moon, Iskra performed a dark ritual, sacrificing herself to bind the curse. The earth quaked as Aldrich's mansion burned, and the screams of the landowner and his family echoed through the fields. The villagers cheered, but their victory was short-lived. By dawn, the fertile fields had withered, and a grotesque scarecrow stood in the center of the land, a figure made from Aldrich's bones, its hollow sockets glowing faintly green. From that day forward, the land was forsaken, and any who entered the field vanished without a trace. Generations passed, and the story of the Bone Scarecrow became a cautionary tale. But not everyone heeded the warnings. Nathan, a young drifter and petty thief, arrived in the village one fateful autumn. Hearing whispers of treasure buried beneath the cursed field, he scoffed at the villagers' superstitions. "It's just an old story to keep fools away," Nathan said, sneering. "Curses don't scare me." Determined to claim the supposed riches for himself, Nathan ventured into the field on the night of a full moon. The air was unnaturally still, the only sound the crunch of dead grass beneath his boots. The scarecrow loomed in the distance, its tattered cloak flapping despite the absence of wind. As he approached, a chill crept up his spine, but he dismissed it as his imagination. When he reached the center of the field, he began digging. The ground was cold and unyielding, but he pressed on, driven by greed. Hours passed, and his hands bled from the effort. Just as his spade struck something solid, a voice whispered from the darkness, "You disturb the resting place of the damned." Nathan froze, his heart pounding. He turned to find the scarecrow standing impossibly close, its skeletal face twisted in a ghastly grin. Its hollow eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its bony fingers reached toward him. Panicking, Nathan dropped his spade and ran. The field seemed to stretch endlessly, the rows of withered crops transforming into a maze. No matter how far he ran, the scarecrow's presence was always behind him, its ragged laughter echoing in the night. "You cannot escape the curse," it hissed. "Your greed binds you to this soil." Exhausted and delirious, Nathan stumbled upon the remains of Aldrich's mansion. The ruins were shrouded in mist, the walls scorched black. Desperate, he sought shelter within, but the house was alive with shadows. Faces of the villagers who had died in the curse stared at him from the walls, their eyes accusing. The scarecrow appeared in the doorway, its skeletal form illuminated by the moonlight. "This is where your greed has brought you," it said. "Now join the harvest." Nathan screamed as the scarecrow's bony hands seized him, dragging him back to the center of the field. The earth beneath him split open, revealing a pit filled with bones. He fought, but the soil swallowed him, his cries muffled as dirt filled his mouth. The last thing he saw was the scarecrow's grinning visage. When the villagers awoke the next morning, they found a new scarecrow standing in the field. Its tattered clothes and twisted limbs bore an uncanny resemblance to Nathan. From that day on, the field grew colder, the whispers grew louder, and the Bone Scarecrow's legend deepened. The curse of the Bone Scarecrow remains unbroken. Each generation brings new victims, drawn by greed, desperation, or sheer defiance of the warnings. The field consumes them all, their souls becoming part of the unholy harvest. One stormy night, years after Nathan's disappearance, a group of treasure hunters arrived in the village, armed with modern tools and skepticism. Ignoring the villagers' frantic warnings, they ventured into the field of bones. Under the flickering light of their lanterns, the scarecrow's hollow eyes seemed to follow their every move. Laughter, soft and distant at first, grew louder with each step they took. As they began digging, the ground trembled. Shadows rose from the soil, taking the shape of the countless souls claimed by the curse. The hunters tried to flee, but the scarecrow's skeletal hands emerged from the earth, dragging them one by one into the pit of bones. Their screams pierced the night, but no one came to their aid. By morning, the field was eerily silent. A new row of scarecrows stood in the soil, each one bearing the terrified expressions of the hunters. The whispers in the wind grew louder, carrying with them a chilling warning. The harvest is eternal. The cursed shall never rest. Villagers now avoid even looking at the field. On moonless nights, they hear the echoing cries of the lost and the ominous rustle of the scarecrow's cloak in the wind. The field of bones remains, a malevolent reminder of human greed and the unrelenting grasp of the damned. And somewhere within the field, the bone scarecrow stands ever watchful, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to trespass into its domain. Story 6. Laughing Jack. The Puppet of Nightmares. In a quiet, run-down neighborhood on the edge of the city, there was a house no one dared to enter. For decades, it stood empty, its windows darkened by grime, its walls overrun with ivy. The locals told stories about the house, speaking of the cursed family that once lived there and the twisted figure that now haunted its halls. They called him Laughing Jack, the clown of nightmares, whose sinister laughter echoed through the walls on moonless nights. It was said that once he chose a victim, there was no escape. Years ago, Laughing Jack was not the horror he is today. He was created as a magical toy by a traveling carnival's mysterious puppet master, intended to bring joy to lonely children. Jack was bright and colorful, with a striped suit and a painted smile that could light up any room. But when the carnival disappeared, Jack was forgotten, abandoned in the dusty attic of a home whose occupants had long since left. Decades passed, and Jack's once cheerful colors faded. Trapped in darkness, he began to change. Loneliness twisted his playful nature into something malevolent, and his painted smile grew cruel. When the house finally found new occupants, they unknowingly unleashed the monster Laughing Jack had become. The latest residents of the house were the Millers, a family of 3. Thomas and Abigail were a young couple trying to rebuild their lives after financial hardship. Their 6-year-old son, Ben, was shy and introverted, spending most of his time with imaginary friends. When they moved into the dilapidated house, they ignored the warnings of the neighbors. "It's just a story to scare us," Thomas reassured Abigail. But Ben, with his childlike intuition, seemed uneasy from the very beginning. "There's someone in the house," Ben whispered to his mother one night. "I can hear him laughing." Abigail dismissed it as her son's imagination. But over the next few weeks, strange things began to happen. It started with the sound of faint music coming from the attic, a warped, out-of-tune melody. Then there were the scratches on the walls, as if something with long claws was moving through the house. Ben began talking to someone who wasn't there, giggling as if he were sharing a private joke. One night, while Abigail was tucking Ben into bed, he turned to her with wide, innocent eyes. "Mom, Jack says he likes you. He says you're pretty." Abigail froze. "Who's Jack?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "My new friend," Ben said. "He's really funny, but sometimes he scares me." Over the following nights, the Millers' home descended into chaos. Jack's presence became undeniable. The walls would bleed a thick black ooze, and the air was filled with the sickly sweet scent of rotting candy. Thomas began having nightmares of a shadowy figure standing at the foot of his bed, laughing softly. Abigail found her son's toys mutilated, their limbs twisted into grotesque shapes. One night, she woke up to find Ben standing in the hallway, holding a crudely made puppet that resembled Laughing Jack. His eyes were distant, and his lips moved silently, as if he were speaking to someone only he could see. Desperate, Abigail decided to confront whatever was tormenting her family. She climbed into the attic, armed with a flashlight and a crowbar. The air was heavy with the smell of decay, and the floorboards groaned under her weight. In the center of the attic, she found an old, rusted music box. It began playing as soon as she approached, the haunting melody filling the air. And then she saw him. Laughing Jack emerged from the shadows, his striped suit tattered, his face painted with a grotesque grin. His hollow eyes glowed with malevolent glee. "Welcome to my playhouse," he crooned, his voice a distorted blend of mockery and malice. Abigail screamed, but before she could run, Jack lunged at her, his claws tearing through the air. She barely escaped, slamming the attic door shut behind her. But Jack's laughter followed her down the stairs, echoing through the house like a sinister lullaby. That night, the Millers tried to leave the house, but the doors wouldn't open. The windows shattered inward, and the walls seemed to close in. Jack's laughter was everywhere, growing louder and more hysterical. Thomas went to check on Ben, only to find his son sitting on the floor, surrounded by broken toys. "He's here," Ben whispered. "He says it's time to play." Before Thomas could react, the lights went out. In the darkness, Jack's glowing eyes appeared, and his laughter became a deafening roar. Abigail and Thomas screamed as Jack descended upon them, his claws ripping through flesh and bone. When the police arrived the next morning, they found the house empty. Blood smeared the walls, and the furniture was overturned, but there was no sign of the Millers. In Ben's room, they found a single object, the crude puppet that looked like Laughing Jack. Its painted grin seemed wider, more sinister than before. The house was condemned and eventually torn down, but the legend of Laughing Jack lived on. People claimed to hear his laughter in the dead of night, and children in the neighborhood spoke of a clown who appeared in their dreams, promising to play with them forever. To this day, the story of Laughing Jack continues to terrify those who hear it. They say he is still out there, waiting for his next victim. If you hear the sound of warped carnival music or faint laughter in the dark, beware. Do not investigate, do not answer, and above all, do not play his games. Because once you do, you'll never escape his twisted circus of nightmares. Story 7. The Blood Ball. In the heart of a forgotten town, nestled beside the ominous Evernight Forest, there existed an ancient legend that no one dared to discuss openly. They whispered about Lilith, a vampire with glowing red eyes and a smile that revealed razor-sharp fangs. She was a predator of the night, whose beauty was as hypnotic as it was deadly. Tales spoke of her luring curious souls into the forest, where they vanished forever. The legend persisted through generations, yet none dared venture into the Evernight Forest during a full moon. They said that was when Lilith held her blood ball, a macabre celebration of death and despair. Those who heard the haunting music from the woods were never seen again, their fates sealed by the creature who danced beneath the moonlight. Jake, a skeptical young man who recently moved to the town, dismissed the stories as mere folklore designed to frighten children. His sharp wit and arrogance made him immune to the fears of the locals. "There's no such thing as vampires," he laughed, ignoring the worried glances of his neighbors. One evening, Jake discovered a black envelope slipped under his door. The envelope bore a crimson seal, embossed with an intricate symbol of a crescent moon encircled by thorns. Inside was a single card, written in elegant, swirling script. "You are cordially invited to the Blood Ball. Midnight, Evernight Forest." Despite the ominous invitation, Jake's curiosity was piqued. Against the warnings of the townsfolk, he decided to attend the so-called Blood Ball, convinced it was some elaborate prank. On the night of the full moon, Jake ventured into Evernight Forest. The air was unusually cold, and the silence was deafening. As he walked deeper into the woods, a faint melody reached his ears. A haunting tune played on an unseen violin. The music grew louder, leading him to a clearing bathed in pale moonlight. The clearing was surreal, as though it belonged to another world. Dozens of figures in elegant Victorian attire danced in slow circles. Their faces were obscured by ornate masks, and their movements were unnaturally graceful. At the center of the clearing stood Lilith. She was mesmerizing. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her back, and her crimson lips curved into a smile that was equal parts inviting and menacing. Her eyes glowed like embers, locking onto Jake the moment he entered the clearing. "Welcome," she purred, her voice smooth and melodic. "You must be Jake. I've been expecting you." Lilith guided Jake into the center of the clearing, her touch cold as ice. The masked dancers parted to make way for them, their hollow gazes fixed on the newcomer. The violinist, a gaunt figure with skeletal hands, played a faster, more frantic tune. "Dance with me," Lilith whispered, pulling Jake close. Her movements were hypnotic, and he couldn't resist her charm. The world around him blurred as he became entranced by her piercing red eyes. As the dance continued, Jake began to notice the unsettling details of his surroundings. The dancers' masks were not masks at all, but faces frozen in expressions of terror. Their bodies moved stiffly, as if controlled by invisible strings. The ground beneath his feet was damp, stained dark with what he realized was blood. "What is this place?" Jake stammered, his voice shaking. Lilith's smile widened, revealing her fangs. "This, my dear, is my domain, and you are the guest of honor." The music stopped abruptly, and the dancers froze in place. Lilith stepped back, her expression shifting from seductive to predatory. "You came here of your own free will, Jake," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "And now, you will play your part." The dancers began to close in, their faces contorted in grotesque, lifeless grins. Jake tried to run, but the forest seemed to close around him, the trees twisting and reaching out like skeletal hands. Lilith watched with amusement as her prey struggled. "Did you think you could leave?" she asked, laughing softly. "No one leaves the blood ball." Jake was forced to his knees by the dancers, their icy hands gripping his arms. Lilith approached, her crimson eyes glowing brighter. She leaned in, her fangs grazing his neck. "Your blood will sustain me, but your fear," she whispered, inhaling deeply. "Your fear is exquisite." As Lilith sank her fangs into Jake's neck, a wave of excruciating pain coursed through his body. His vision blurred, and the world around him seemed to dissolve into darkness. When he awoke, he was no longer himself. Jake found himself standing among the other dancers, his body stiff and cold. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. He was now one of them, a puppet in Lilith's eternal performance, doomed to dance for eternity under her cruel gaze. Lilith turned to her new creation, her smile never fading. "You'll make a fine addition to my collection," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. The townsfolk noticed Jake's disappearance, but dared not search for him. They had seen it happen too many times before. The blood ball was not just a legend, it was a living nightmare. And Lilith was its queen. On nights of the full moon, faint music could be heard drifting from the forest. Those who ventured too close reported seeing glowing red eyes watching them from the shadows. Some claimed to hear the whispers of the dancers, begging for release. But no one dared to enter the clearing, for they knew that Lilith awaited, ready to claim her next victim. To this day, the legend of Lilith and the blood ball persists. They say if you find a black envelope with a crimson seal, do not open it. If you hear music in the woods on a full moon, turn away and run. For once Lilith chooses you, There is no escape. And if you see her glowing red eyes in the darkness, know that you are already hers. Lilith's laughter echoes through the Evernight forest, a chilling reminder of her insatiable hunger. Her blood ball continues, an eternal celebration of fear and death, with new guests joining the dance with every passing moon. Story 8. The Soul Reaper, a tale of eternal terror. Far beyond the edge of any map, where the earth is cracked and dry as ancient parchment, there lies a cursed expanse known only as the Field of Souls. For centuries, the name has been whispered in fear by travelers and nomads, each claiming to have seen visions of a skeletal figure cloaked in black, gliding through the dust storms with a scythe that gleamed like molten silver. This was no ordinary ghost story. The villagers living on the outskirts of the desert swore that those who entered the Field of Souls never returned. Their voices would, however, live on, echoing as faint cries on the wind, warning the living to stay far away. It was said that centuries ago, the land had been fertile, a thriving kingdom ruled by a tyrannical king whose greed knew no bounds. When famine struck, the king hoarded grain in towering silos while his people starved. Desperate and betrayed, the villagers turned to a wandering mystic, begging her to curse the king. She did, but the curse came with a price none had anticipated. The mystic summoned the Soul Reaper, a primordial entity born from humanity's darkest fears. He obliterated the kingdom in a single night, turning its golden fields into barren wasteland. The king's screams echoed into eternity as the Reaper claimed his soul, and the villagers' pleas for mercy were swallowed by the unyielding blackness. The Reaper, however, was insatiable. Once unleashed, he could not be contained. Now he wanders the desert, a predator of souls, feeding on the fear and despair of those foolish enough to enter his domain. In the modern day, 3 friends, Nathan, Emily, and Jacob, heard the legend while exploring ancient ruins near the edge of the desert. They were documentary filmmakers, always searching for the next big story to elevate their careers. The locals warned them against venturing into the Field of Souls, pleading with them to abandon their foolish quest. "You don't understand," an old man warned, his voice trembling. "The Reaper is real. He takes those who wander too far." But Nathan, the leader of the group, dismissed the warnings. "It's just a myth," he said confidently. "Every legend has a kernel of truth, and we're going to find it." Emily and Jacob hesitated, but eventually agreed, their curiosity outweighing their fear. Armed with cameras, drones, and survival gear, they ventured into the barren expanse as the sun began to set. The first sign that something was wrong came with the wind. It was silent at first, an eerie calm that pressed down on them like an invisible weight. But as night fell, the wind began to howl, carrying whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. "Do you hear that?" Emily asked, clutching her camera tightly. Her voice wavered, her eyes darting toward the horizon. Jacob nodded, his face pale. "It's probably just the wind," he muttered, though his tone lacked conviction. Nathan laughed nervously. "Relax, guys. It's just our minds playing tricks on us. Let's keep moving." But the whispers grew louder, forming words that sent chills down their spines. "Turn back. Leave this place. He's coming." The trio stopped in their tracks as the temperature plummeted. Frost began to form on their equipment despite the desert's arid heat. And then they saw it. A figure in the distance, cloaked in black, its skeletal face illuminated by the faint glow of its fiery eyes. The figure moved closer, not walking, but gliding across the cracked earth. His scythe gleamed in the moonlight, leaving trails of sparks as it scraped the ground. Nathan raised his camera, determined to capture the moment, but his hands trembled so violently that the footage was nothing but a blur. "Who are you?" Nathan shouted, his voice breaking. The Reaper stopped a few feet away, towering over them. When he spoke, his voice was a cacophony of screams, as though thousands of souls were trapped within him, crying out in eternal torment. "I am the harbinger of despair," the Reaper intoned. "You have entered my domain, and for that, you shall pay the ultimate price." With a sudden, bone-chilling laugh, he raised his scythe and swung it through the air. The blade didn't touch them, yet they felt an invisible force tear through their bodies. Emily screamed as an ethereal version of herself was pulled from her physical form, her soul writhing in agony as the Reaper consumed it. Nathan and Jacob ran blindly into the darkness, their breaths ragged and hearts pounding. The whispers in the wind turned into mocking laughter, and the ground beneath them seemed to shift and twist, leading them in circles. No matter how far they ran, they always ended up back at the same spot where Emily had fallen. "We have to get out of here," Jacob cried, tears streaming down his face. "We're going to die." Nathan grabbed Jacob by the shoulders, shaking him. "We can't panic. There has to be a way." But before he could finish, Jacob let out a strangled scream. The Reaper emerged from the shadows, his skeletal hand outstretched. Jacob's body convulsed as his soul was ripped from his chest, leaving behind a hollow husk that crumpled to the ground. Nathan was the last one standing. He stumbled through the desert, his mind unraveling with each step. He saw visions of the Reaper's past victims, their faces twisted in eternal torment. Their voices filled his ears, begging him to turn back, to save himself. But it was too late. The Reaper appeared before him, blocking his path. "Do you see now?" the entity asked, its voice a venomous hiss. "You sought truth, but all you found was death." Nathan fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "Please," he begged. "I didn't mean to." The Reaper laughed, a sound that shook the very earth. "Your soul will feed the void. Welcome to eternity, Nathan." With one final swing of his scythe, the world went black. Weeks later, a rescue team ventured into the desert, searching for the missing filmmakers. They found no bodies, only the trio's equipment scattered across the cracked earth. The cameras were intact, but the footage was distorted, filled with static and glimpses of a shadowy figure. As the team left the desert, they swore they heard whispers on the wind, faint but unmistakable. "Turn back. He's coming." The Field of Souls remains a forbidden place, its legend growing with each passing year. They say that if you venture too close, you can still hear the Reaper's laughter, a chilling reminder of the souls he has claimed. And for those foolish enough to enter, there is no escape. The Reaper waits, his scythe ready to harvest the next victim. For in his domain, death is not the end. It is only the beginning. Story 9. The Nun of Eternal Shadows. Perched atop a jagged hill, shrouded in perpetual mist, there stood an ancient convent known as Sanctum Noctis, the sanctuary of the night. Long abandoned, its crumbling walls bore the weight of centuries-old secrets, and its towering spires reached toward the heavens as though pleading for salvation. The townsfolk in the nearby village spoke of it only in whispers, for Sanctum Noctis was said to be cursed, a place where the living dared not tread and the dead refused to rest. Legends told of a time when the convent was inhabited by an order of nuns who had forsaken the light of God, turning instead to darker powers. Among them was Sister Mara, a woman of unparalleled beauty whose eyes were like bottomless voids. It was said that Mara, driven by forbidden whispers, led the sisters in performing an unspeakable ritual to summon a being of unimaginable darkness. But the ritual went awry, and the entity they called forth consumed them all. leaving their souls trapped within the sanctuary's walls for eternity. The story of Sanctum Noctis became a cautionary tale passed down through generations. Travelers who strayed too close to the hill claimed to hear mournful chants echoing through the night and to see faint, flickering lights in the convent's windows. Some spoke of a figure cloaked in black, her face pale and ghastly, her eyes glowing like embers. She was said to roam the ruins, seeking to ensnare the souls of the curious and the foolish. Despite these warnings, there were always those who could not resist the allure of the unknown. One such group was a team of paranormal investigators. Claire, a journalist hungry for a groundbreaking story. Ethan, a skeptical tech expert. Sophie, a sensitive who claimed to feel the presence of spirits. And Lucas, a cameraman eager to capture proof of the supernatural. Together, they ventured into the shadow of Sanctum Noctis, armed with cameras, equipment, and a naive belief that they could face whatever lay within. The journey to Sanctum Noctis was uneventful at first. As the group ascended the hill, the air grew colder, and an unnatural silence enveloped them. No birds sang, no insects chirped. The only sound was the crunch of their footsteps on the rocky path. When they reached the convent's gates, Claire hesitated. The iron bars were twisted and rusted, as though something immense had torn them apart. Beyond the gates, the sanctuary loomed like a great, slumbering beast, its windows dark and lifeless. "This is it," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's make history." As they stepped through the gates, the wind howled, and the doors to the convent creaked open as if inviting them inside. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. The walls were adorned with faded murals depicting biblical scenes, but over the years, the paint had warped, giving the figures grotesque, almost demonic expressions. The team set up their equipment in the main hall, where a massive crucifix hung above a dilapidated altar. "I don't like this place," Sophie murmured, clutching a rosary she always carried. "It's watching us." Ethan rolled his eyes. "It's just an old building. Let's not scare ourselves before anything even happens." But Sophie was right. As the team moved through the sanctuary, shadows seemed to shift and writhe in the corners of their vision. Faint whispers drifted through the air, too quiet to understand, but loud enough to unsettle. The temperature dropped sharply, and their breath became visible in the dim light of their flashlights. Then they found her. In a side chapel, they discovered a life-sized statue of Sister Mara. She stood at the center of a circle of skulls, her head bowed, her hands clasped in prayer. Her face was eerily lifelike, with hollow eyes that seemed to follow them as they moved. Around her neck hung a rosary made of tiny bones, and carved into the floor beneath her feet was an inscription in Latin. "In tenebris perpetuis, animae nostrae manebunt." "What does it mean?" Lucas asked, his voice trembling. Claire translated, her voice shaky. "In eternal darkness, our souls shall remain." As she spoke, the statue's eyes began to glow faintly. The skulls around its base rattled, and the temperature plummeted further. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the chapel. "You should not have come," a voice whispered, cold and venomous. The team froze as the statue's head slowly lifted, and Sister Mara's hollow gaze locked onto them. The lights on their cameras flickered and died, plunging the team into darkness. The only illumination came from the faint, ghostly glow of Mara's eyes. The air grew thick, making it hard to breathe, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of anguish and despair. "Run!" Claire shouted, but it was too late. The chapel doors slammed shut, and the floor beneath them began to crack. From the fissures emerged skeletal hands, their bony fingers clawing at the air. Shadows coalesced into twisted forms, their faces contorted in eternal screams. One by one, the team was separated. Sophie's screams echoed as she was dragged into the darkness, her rosary slipping from her grasp. Lucas's camera captured his final moments as he was pulled into a shattered mirror, his reflection screaming silently before disappearing. Ethan tried to fight, but his body froze as Mara's gaze fell upon him. He collapsed, his soul ripped from his body in a burst of cold light. Claire was the last one standing. She stumbled back into the main hall, her flashlight flickering. The crucifix above the altar now hung upside down, dripping with blood. Mara's figure emerged from the shadows, her face a mask of malevolent glee. "You sought the truth," Mara said, her voice echoing with 1,000 tortured souls. "Now you will become part of it." Claire tried to pray, but the words caught in her throat. Mara extended a hand, and Claire felt an icy grip around her heart. Her vision blurred as her body was lifted into the air. She saw the faces of her friends, their hollow eyes staring back at her from the shadows. With a final, deafening laugh, Mara crushed Claire's soul, and the sanctuary fell silent once more. The team's footage was discovered weeks later, their cameras found abandoned at the edge of the hill. The recordings were incoherent, filled with static and fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures. The final moments showed Claire's terrified face as she whispered, "Don't come here," before the screen went black. Sanctum Noctis remains untouched, its cursed walls a monument to the horrors within. On nights of the blood moon, villagers swear they can see figures moving in the windows and hear faint, mournful chants carried on the wind. And in the sanctuary's heart, Sister Mara waits, her eternal vigil fueled by the souls of those who dare disturb her slumber. If you ever find yourself near the shadow of Sanctum Noctis, heed this warning. Do not enter. Do not listen to the whispers. For once you step inside, you will never leave. And if you see her glowing eyes in the darkness, pray that she does not see you back. Story 10. The Curse of Anubis. Deep in the heart of Egypt's vast desert, hidden beneath relentless dunes and scorching winds, lies an ancient pyramid lost to history. Known among locals as the Tomb of Anubis, it is said to be a forbidden place, veiled in secrecy and steeped in dread. Legends describe it not as the resting place of a pharaoh, but as the prison of Anubis, the ancient god of the dead, who was betrayed by his own worshippers and sealed away for eternity. It is whispered that anyone who disturbs his slumber will awaken his wrath and suffer a fate worse than death. Few dared to approach the pyramid, and those who did never returned. Some claimed to hear whispers carried on the desert wind, warnings to turn back. Others swore they saw fiery red eyes watching them from the darkness, and the faint sound of chains dragging across stone. Yet despite these ominous tales, there were always those who refused to heed the warnings. In the modern day, a team of archaeologists led by the ambitious and unrelenting Dr. Marcus Harrington set out to uncover the secrets of the Tomb of Anubis. His team included Sophia Bennett, an expert in ancient Egyptian texts, Ethan Carter, a skilled engineer specializing in excavation technology, Daniel Moore, the group's fearless cameraman, and Rachel Wells, a historian obsessed with ancient curses. Together, they sought to do what no one else had dared, to unlock the mysteries of the lost pyramid and bring its secrets to light. The journey to the pyramid was grueling. The sun beat down mercilessly as the group crossed the endless expanse of sand. When they finally arrived, the pyramid loomed before them like a shadow cast by death itself. Its surface was weathered and cracked, its entrance sealed by a massive stone door engraved with hieroglyphs depicting Anubis holding a pair of scales. Above him, an ominous inscription read, "Those who disturb the balance shall be judged. Their hearts will be weighed, and their souls devoured." Sophia hesitated, her fingers tracing the ancient symbols. "This isn't just a warning," she said, her voice trembling. "It's a curse." "Superstitions won't stop us," Marcus said, brushing past her. "We're here to make history." With the help of Ethan's equipment, the team pried open the stone door, unleashing a rush of stale, frigid air. The passage beyond was shrouded in darkness, and the walls were adorned with depictions of Anubis overseeing the dead. As they ventured deeper, the air grew colder, and an oppressive silence enveloped them. Their flashlights illuminated scenes of judgment and torment, figures kneeling before Anubis, their souls being devoured by a monstrous shadow in the shape of a jackal. "These carvings," Rachel murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're warnings. This isn't a tomb, it's a prison." Marcus dismissed her concerns, pressing onward until they reached a vast chamber at the heart of the pyramid. In the center stood a massive obsidian sarcophagus, its surface etched with intricate patterns and ancient curses. Around it were scattered fragments of golden relics, long since tarnished by time. "This is it," Marcus said, his eyes gleaming with triumph. The resting place of Anubis. Ignoring Sophia's protests, Marcus began to pry open the sarcophagus. As the lid shifted, a low, guttural growl echoed through the chamber, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. A wave of cold air surged outward, extinguishing their flashlights and plunging the room into darkness. "What was that?" Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, a pair of glowing red eyes appeared in the darkness, followed by the sound of chains dragging across stone. The team froze as a towering figure emerged from the shadows. It was Anubis, but not the serene deity depicted in ancient texts. This Anubis was a horrifying amalgamation of flesh and shadow, his muscular frame covered in glowing hieroglyphic scars, his jackal head twisted into a grotesque snarl. In one hand, he held a massive scythe, its blade dripping with an otherworldly black ichor. "Who dares disturb my slumber?" Anubis roared, his voice reverberating like thunder. "You have defiled my prison. Now, you shall face judgment." Panic erupted as the team scrambled to escape, but the pyramid seemed to come alive, its walls shifting and closing off their exits. Shadows coalesced into spectral forms, their hollow eyes filled with malice as they reached for the intruders. Ethan was the first to fall, his screams echoing as a shadowy tendril wrapped around his throat and dragged him into the darkness. "We have to get out of here," Rachel cried, clutching her pendant as if it could protect her. But there was no escape. The chamber's walls began to close in, and the ground beneath them cracked, revealing an endless abyss filled with writhing souls. Anubis turned his gaze to Daniel, who was still filming despite his trembling hands. "Your greed blinds you," the god snarled. "Let me show you the price of your arrogance." With a flick of his scythe, Daniel's soul was ripped from his body, his lifeless corpse collapsing to the ground. Panic erupted as the team scrambled to escape, but the pyramid seemed to come alive, its walls shifting and closing off their exits. Shadows coalesced into spectral forms, their hollow eyes filled with malice as they reached for the intruders. Ethan was the first to fall, his screams echoing as a shadowy tendril wrapped around his throat and dragged him into the darkness. "We have to get out of here," Rachel cried, clutching her pendant as if it could protect her. But there was no escape. The chamber's walls began to close in, and the ground beneath them cracked, revealing an endless abyss filled with writhing souls. Anubis turned his gaze to Daniel, who was still filming despite his trembling hands. "Your greed blinds you," the god snarled. "Let me show you the price of your arrogance." With a flick of his scythe, Daniel's soul was ripped from his body, his lifeless corpse collapsing to the ground. Sophia, clutching an ancient amulet she had found earlier, desperately tried to decipher the glyphs around the sarcophagus. "There must be a way to seal him again," she muttered, tears streaming down her face. "Foolish mortal," Anubis said, advancing toward her. "You cannot contain what was never meant to be bound." Summoning her courage, Sophia raised the amulet and began to chant the incantation inscribed on its surface. A blinding light erupted from the artifact, forcing Anubis to stagger back. But the victory victory was short-lived. The amulet shattered in her hands, and Anubis let out a triumphant laugh. "Did you think you could imprison me again?" he sneered. "I am eternal." Marcus, now alone, fell to his knees before Anubis, begging for mercy. "Please," he sobbed, "I didn't mean to disturb you. Let me go, and I'll make sure no one ever comes here again." Anubis tilted his head, a cruel grin spreading across his face. "Your words are meaningless," he said. "Your soul is mine." With a swift strike of his scythe, Marcus's body was split in two, his soul dragged into the abyss. The pyramid fell silent once more, its walls stained with the blood of the intruders. Months later, a rescue team found the group's abandoned equipment near the entrance to the pyramid. The footage on the cameras was fragmented and distorted, showing glimpses of Anubis's horrifying form and the team's final moments. The last recording ended with a chilling message scrawled in blood. "He is awake. Run." The pyramid was sealed again, but the curse of Anubis remained. Locals claimed to hear whispers on the wind and see glowing red eyes watching them from the dunes. Those who ventured too close were never seen again. The tomb of Anubis stands as a monument to humanity's hubris, a place where the living dare not tread. But for those who are tempted by its secrets, remember this: once you enter, there is no escape. The god of the dead waits, his scythe ready to claim your soul. And when you hear his voice in the darkness, pray that it is not your heart he has come to weigh.